Chapter 1. Houston, we have a problem. On April 13th, 1970, only 53 hours after the Apollo 13 rocket had taken off towards the moon, Jack Swigert, the least known of the astronauts on this flight, made a statement that has since become one of the most popular of all of the NASA space program's history. He stated as clearly and as calmly as possible to those at Mission Control Headquarters, "Houston, we have a problem." At first, those on the ground near the launch site were confused and asked for him to repeat himself. His fellow astronaut, Jim Lovell, then repeated almost word for word, "Houston, we've had a problem." I've always loved what I've been able to learn from this experience. First, they both stated clearly and calmly that there was a problem. Although even the smallest problem in space could have serious, life-threatening outcomes, they stayed calm and collected. Second, the transfer of information was to let others know that there was a problem. Third, they all then worked together to find a solution to the life-threatening problem. When I think of this, I cannot help but see its similarities to the problem of suicidal ideations, the clinical term for thinking about committing suicide. First, to even think of starting to address the problem, we must first state what the problem is, openly, calmly, factually, to present the problem with clarity so that we know what the actual problem truly is, so that we can understand its severity. Second, the sharing of this information so that we can open people's eyes to what we know and have more people become aware of the problem and its severity. Third, so that we can all find some common ground on ways to address and hopefully work together to get rid of this horrible problem. The following section is going to state some facts and figures related to suicide, suicidal behavior, populations that attempt suicide more often than others, and additional insights to get a greater understanding of the problem at hand. 2018 and 2019 were the first reportings in over 150 years where the CDC stated that there was a life expectancy decrease. Instead of the lifespan getting longer, as it had been recorded every other year prior, the lifespan, the number of years, months, days that people were living, decreased. Although there were many reasons cited, the two biggest contributors, the two biggest causes were 1, heroin overdose, and 2, the increase of the numbers of suicides. There are many distinct factors that increase the risk of suicide, as well as some commonly found populations factors that reduce the risk of suicide. It's important to point both out. First, so that if we have a loved one, or possibly yourself, we can work towards solving the problem by eliminating these common factors. Some might be resolved within a brief period, whereas others might require decades and generations to overcome. Regardless of the time required, it is important to keep them in our minds for the greater good of not just those living today, but for those in the future. It is for this reason that I am placing some of these facts here at this time. Before I do, though, I want to ask you to remember to not lose faith, to stay strong, to act like a warrior of light for good, standing strong even in the face of the insight that I'm about to relay to you now. Also, know that most of these facts and statistics that are presented at this time are from 2019, which, as of the time of this printing of this book, are the most recent. Suicide rates and risks in the United States. Between the 20-year span from 1999 to 2019, suicide rates have increased 33%, making it recognized by the CDC as the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. In 2019, more than 47,500 known suicidal deaths were recorded. That averages out to about 1 every 11 minutes. Those seriously contemplating suicide are even higher at an estimated 12 million. 3.5 million, about twice the population of Nebraska, stated that they have planned their own suicide, a major sign of an attempt. A whooping 1.4 million people have sadly attempted suicide. To put this into perspective, that means that 3.7 of the U.S. population is seriously considering suicide. Almost 4 out of every 100 people, or 1 out of every 25, are considering making that final decision. Yet how many people are talking about it openly, attempting to bring light on the subject? It affects all ages. In the 10 to 34 age range, it's the second leading cause of death. The fourth leading cause of death for those in the 35 to 44 age range, and the fifth leading cause of death in the 45 to 54-year-old range. It is more common in Native American and non-Hispanic white populations. It is also notably higher for military veterans, those living in rural areas, and those working in hard labor jobs like mining and construction. In addition, the CDC backs up something that I noticed on the adolescent psychiatric units I've worked on. Those younger people who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, and or transgender have a greater incidence of suicide than their peers that identify as straight. Increased stress and anxiety related to not only personal but also local, national, and worldwide events increase the incidence of suicide. This was seen with a drastic increase in the suicides and suicide attempts shortly after the 2020 outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. A June 2020 survey of over 2,000 young adults between the ages of 18 and 24 found that over 70% seriously considered suicide. Additional facts related to suicide from the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention show that age-adjusted suicide rate in 2019 was 13.93 per 100,000. There are an average of 130 suicides per day in the United States. The rate of suicide is highest in middle-aged white men. In 2019, men died by suicide 3.63 times more often than women. This means that even though women attempt suicide much more often than men choose ways that are much more fatal, thus resulting in more suicide deaths by men. Firearms account for 50.39% of all suicide deaths. 93% of adults surveyed in the United States think that suicide can be prevented. Money, money, money. In a 2010 study titled Relative Status and Well-Being, Evidence from the U.S. Suicide Deaths, conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, along with members of the United States Census Bureau members, found startling information related to financial status and suicide. They found that those that earn less than $34,000 annually were 50% more likely to commit suicide. It was also noted that unemployment had a major impact on possible increased risk of suicide. They found that being unemployed or out of the labor force for any reason raises the risk of suicide compared to someone that is employed. In fact, those that are unemployed were found to be 72% more likely to commit suicide than other people who are working. In addition, retirees and people that are on leave from work also have higher suicide rates. Clinical and research psychologist Dr. Jordan B. Peterson has made the claim that one of the reasons for depression is the lack of a sense of purpose or meaning in one's life. It is compounded by the difficulties that come from not having money to pay for one's basic needs, as well as the possible lack of friendship and person-to-person interactions. For one reason or another, some people only have interactions and friendships with those they work with. With the sudden lack of personal interaction with others, we frequently go on into a depressed state. This is due to us being hardwired for interaction with other people. We will discuss this further in the chapter titled, You Don't Know What You Don't Know, Chapter 3. M. Harvey Brenner, a visiting professor in the Global Health Division of the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health at Yale School of Medicine and the principal investigator in this study, stated, economic growth is the single most crucial factor relating to the length of life. Brenner is also a professor of health policy and management at Johns Hopkins University and senior professor of epidemiology at Berlin University of Technology. He also stated, unemployment is the essential element of social status, and it establishes a person as a contributing member of society, and it also has very important implications for self-esteem. Brenner went on to say, when that is taken away, people become susceptible to depression, cardiovascular disease, AIDS, and many other illnesses that increase mortality. 'Tis the season. The author T.S. Eliot once stated, April is the cruelest month. He might not be too far from the truth. Studies have also shown that certain times of the year have a greater number of suicides than others. Although many people notice the increase in the number of suicides around the holiday season from late November to early January, it is not statistically the riskiest time of year for those that are contemplating. Although the winter blues do affect some during the cold, wet, and gloomy winter months, it is more often that we see an upswing during the late spring and early summer. Some studies suggest that there are possible links between temperature, humidity, sunshine, and taking one's own life. This might be due to the suicide rates being higher among those that live in rural areas and people that work outdoors in labor-intensive jobs. Some scientists have even suggested a possible link between taking one's own life and seasonal allergies. If this is true, it is possibly due to allergies triggering anxiety-producing chemicals and getting in the way of social interactions. According to Dr. Ron Samarian, chief of the Department of Psychiatry at Beaumont Hospital, Royal Oak, Michigan, there are a number of speculations on this. One is the increasing amount of sunlight, which potentially increases activity. That alone does not explain why people kill themselves. Potentially, increased activity gives people the will to follow through with suicide. Dr. Samarian further states that people also may view spring as the dawn of better times, and when that something does not come through, suicides may follow. One last explanation of the possible cause of the increase in the number of suicides during the late spring and early summer is that there are biochemical changes in the body, including changing levels of melatonin and other important neurotransmitters. It could also be those in a manic phase of bipolar disorder showing signs of increased irritability, grandiosity, and incredible surges of energy coupled with poor judgment, which are often triggered during the springtime. Are you high? Another new development over the past few years is the idea that increased suicide numbers might be seen in areas with higher altitudes. The theory is that due to the higher elevation, less oxygenation is seen in the blood, and therefore it decreases the body's serotonin levels, which is one of the main chemicals that helps regulate mood. According to a study done by researchers at the University of Utah and published in the Harvard Review of Psychology in 2018, growing evidence based on large data sets suggests that the altitude of residence is specifically associated with increased risk of suicide and depression. The researchers also found that higher elevations might make popular antidepressants less effective. Brent Kuyos, a University of Utah psychology professor and the lead author of the study, stated, people with depression tend to have less effective utilization in certain parts of their brain, like the prefrontal cortex. He further stated that this energy roadblock means that people have a tougher time overcoming negative emotions. It's interesting to note that according to the CDC, some high elevation states such as Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado, Montana, and Alaska also have abnormally high suicide rates. All the previous states, except for Alaska, make up what is known by some as the suicide belt. One 2006 study looked at almost 9,000 suicide deaths in 15 different states reported by the National Violent Death Reporting System. Noticed that the rate of suicides in higher altitudes was 3 times higher than people living in close to the sea level. The greatest difference was seen between 2,000 and 3,000 feet elevation, meaning that anything above those levels has a much higher suicide rates. It is interesting to note that Salt Lake City is at 4,265 feet, Denver at 5,280 feet, Bozeman at 4,793 feet, Cheyenne is at 6,063, and Albuquerque is at 5,012, all significantly higher altitudes than 3,000 feet. In addition, research studies performed at the University of Utah in 2016 pointed out that increased altitudes affects oxygen depletion in female rats that was not in male rats. This is not only seen in the USA, though. Researchers have discovered similar findings in other countries, too. In the high mountainous areas of Andalusia, Spain, the suicide rates were higher than the rest of the country's average. The same was found in Saudi Arabia, with an increase of suicidal thoughts in depression patients at the Psychiatric Specific Hospital in a high elevation. That rate was 5 times higher than all areas of Saudi Arabia that were at or near sea level. A simple case study. With all this in mind, you might be seeing some similarities between yourself or a loved one for the data showing a higher risk of suicide. Take me as an example. I'm a middle-aged white male. I live in the high elevation above Salt Lake City. I also have seasonal allergies. Although I do consider myself an ally, I do not identify as a member of the Pride movement, nor do I make less than $34,000 annually. I have some factors that on paper would say that I'm at a higher risk for suicide. There are also some factors that I don't have. What is important to realize is that if you or your loved one has some of these factors, even if they have all the factors, it does not mean that you or they are going to attempt to take your or their life. It's your choice. You or they can turn these risk factors into strengths. You have the power to stay strong and to be a force for good in the world. These simply give us things to look at and to be aware of. It's kind of like looking at the enemy, keeping an eye on them. By doing that and being aware, we can notice if the bad thoughts are coming in. This helps us to realize that we can make the choice to take steps that will help us to stay strong and change our mindset. The impact of suicide. It is estimated that the annual cost of suicide in the U.S. alone is more than $70 billion in medical costs and work loss. In independent research done in May 2020 by Christopher M. Duran and Irene Kinchin regarding adolescent suicides state these preventable deaths resulted in a loss of 406,730 years of life at a cost of $5.53 billion in lost economic income, with the average cost of suicide estimated at $802,939. The United States stands out as a country with the most significant youth suicide problem, accounting for 77% of total costs. Reducing youth suicide requires a multifaceted approach and significant investment by governments. However, this pales in comparison to the mental, emotional, and spiritual burden that is left for loved ones of the person that committed suicide. Many surviving loved ones suffer a wide array of negative emotions such as sadness, guilt, anger, shock. Some fall into a deep depression and even attempt suicide themselves. I've had many conversations with those that survived after a loved one has committed suicide. They are often very sad, angry, or even feel unwarranted guilt. The pain that they feel due to the loss of their loved one is oftentimes unbearable. The questions of, what else could I have done differently? Why didn't I see the signs? Is my loved one in a better place now? Run over and over in their head. Some can overcome some of these emotions and thoughts with help and guidance. Others that do not seek help through conventional or unconventional ways sometimes live the rest of their lives in pain and confusion. One of the other frequently unseen impacts of suicide or suicide deaths is that many that have attempted suicide and survived have had serious long-term health problems, including increased depression as a result of their attempt. On a brighter note, more than 90% of those that did survive an attempt on their own life never go on to die from suicide.